Where did heavy metal begin? Most will say Black Sabbath, some will argue Judas Priest, and the rest will contend that if we're anointing Sabbath as the first metal band because of their heaviness, then, well, plenty of other bands were unimpeachably heavy at the time too.
Well, the heaviest one I can think of is High Tide. Their first album came out a year before Sabbath, and it's got the meanest guitar sound I've ever heard. The song Futurist Lament, so heavy. There's bands that put out records at the same time, like 1970, as Sabbath, for instance, Atomic Rooster. You have a Swedish heavy band called Life. Cream, of course, which I love. I mean, they're more sophisticated, if you will, than Black Sabbath. We had a Swedish band called November, heavy blues, three-piece, Vanilla Fudge, Grand Funk, Mountain. But Sabbath get the credit, and I think rightfully so too, because they had that name, that band name, and that kind of spoke to people who wanted to get into that stuff.
Black Sabbath were so supremely dark. Tony Iommi's riff so Herculean, and Ozzy's droning voice carried so much dread and misery that the sound captured on tape, pressed to vinyl, and released on February 13th, 1970, just had to be called something more distinguished than simply rock and roll. The term heavy metal hadn't widely been applied to music, so at the time, Sabbath were not yet dubbed a heavy metal act, much less its forefathers. Downer rock was one of the many terms applied to the band early on, and initially it went over the heads of critics who disregarded the self-titled debut as mere rubbish. So regardless of where you stand exactly on who created metal, the general consensus is, at the least, that heavy metal originated in England, right? Sure, that's a bit easier, but the genre was likely to never surface if it had not been for the blues, which was distinctly American. So let's back this whole thing up a bit.
When you get back to the beginning, like, where's it all come from? It probably comes from Robert Johnson, playing the blues like the devil. That's like pure, like unadulterated passion. And Robert Johnson was arguably the best guitarist of all time. He influenced like everyone, literally everyone, but most notably like Keith from Rolling Stones. You know, like he would fight you, you know, about Robert Johnson. So when you see like how it all comes down, like yeah, it probably all started with blues. So we've got blues to thank for thrash. Heavy metal.
It's the primal emotional weight of blues that resonated deeply within rock's pioneers. Whether it was Johnson's barn-burning guitar playing, the visceral grit that sprung from Howlin' Wolf, or the impassioned wail of Bessie Smith, it was all unequivocally heavy in its own right. And once proper distortion came along, the natural path was to push the limits of the latest technology, and it's these tests of boundaries that largely came to define what it meant to play rock and roll, and later, heavy metal in its many incarnations. With the blues serving as the springboard, Led Zeppelin's pair of 1969 albums, Led Zeppelin and Led Zeppelin II, distanced themselves from the rollicking, blues-tinged hard rock efforts of their peers such as The Who, Cream, the Rolling Stones, as well as Deep Purple, who were just about to make the leap with one ensuing lineup change that catapulted them to rock superstardom over the next decade. But as for Zeppelin,
they were taking blues, which is the heaviest music ever, and will remain the heaviest music ever, and they were kind of amping it up through bigger amplifiers, and they kind of gave it this attitude, a slightly different kind of swagger. But I think the blues being the basis, you've already got the heaviness there. Jimmy Page loves all kinds of music.
Page wasn't the only member of the band revolutionizing the heavy music landscape. Let's not forget about Wildman John Bonham behind the kit.
It's basically just like blues with distortion and way more like high
aggression.
Singing. Yeah, and incredibly aggressive drums as well, and you can see how that.
I think the main thing is the drums, really.
Oh man, literally.
Yeah.
Change the face
Yeah,
of drumming.
it's how I think it's how aggressive and how rhythmic it is.
But like, I mean, you have bands like Cream that were kind of already doing the power chord thing. You know, and then I think it's the drums that really changed and kind of brought that more driving force.
Influence the whole, like, still influencing like generations of drummers as well.
Zeppelin used some distortion early on. Well, not just early on. They played around with distortion and did a lot with it that kind of led to metal. And then there were pre-punk bands like the Stooges who were overdriving everything. Blue Cheer, they were cranking the amps and you know, overdriving them as much as possible to get the distortion.
Now, Blue Cheer in the 60s, 70s was an extremely heavy band for its time. They were the heaviest band to come out of America, I think, ever.
I'm gonna stop you just for a second, Johnny Z. I don't think you're wrong, but let's not forget to give mention to New York's Sir Lord Baltimore. A review in Cream magazine was the first to apply the term heavy metal to a band when describing their 1970 debut, Kingdom Come. All right, now back to Blue Cheer.
They were so powerful and so loud that they had to record their second album, Live Tracks, on a pier, and it could be contained in a studio.
Distortion. The hallmark of any rock and metal guitar sound wasn't instant. There was no flick of the switch moment like Dr. Frankenstein bringing his mangled creation to life. Its development largely hinged on advancing technology, though some artists were impatient and found other ways to achieve the tone they had always envisioned.
You know, you had your pioneers and experimentalists like Link Wray, who wanted a fuzzier sound, but the amps didn't have a distortion at the time. There weren't the pedals. So he would actually slit the cones in the speaker with razors, and it would create this kind of really buzzing, vibrant sound. There were a few bands, surf bands, did some of that. I may be wrong, but I think the Kinks slashed their speakers before they turned to distortion and pedals.
With early distortion at their fingertips, generations of guitar players would go on to search for ways to build upon the foundation laid by the previous era of guitarists, who all played around with this increasingly thunderous new sound they were capable of getting.
A bunch of those old tube amps, just the sounds you get out of them, I think were really essential in the creation of heavy metal. How the riffs came out were because of the heads sounded a certain way turned on 10.
You had companies like Marshall come out, Boss with effect pedals. It just opened the gates further and allowed bands to tailor their sound to create as much or as little as distortion as they wanted to kind of fit their image and the tone that they were going for.
Coupled with distortion and overdrive, innovative playing techniques helped maximize the desired effect. One of those influential players was the groundbreaking Jimi Hendrix, who controlled massive swells of volume, harnessing the power of feedback, using it to his advantage.
The way he used feedback was unparalleled, almost creating melodies out of squealing sound that weren't concrete notes. But even now, I think a lot of people nod to Hendrix for just creating the wildness of a rock sound.
So where does this all lead us? Back to Black Sabbath, of course. Well, actually, let's dive into their hometown of Birmingham, which is also where Judas Priest formed, which was ravaged by World War II bombings. This left the next generation to feel those effects economically, which led to teenagers and young adults pursuing an escape from the most blue-collar of lifestyles. Steam hammers could be heard from factories pounding in the distance, and these jarring, rhythmic machinations certainly fostered an environment where those sounds could be translated through heavy music. Life was bleak, with not much to aspire to beyond a lifetime of hard-nosed work, which still wasn't always enough to guarantee sustainable living for a family. This grim outlook was channeled into messages of hopelessness and despair, also leading to feelings of isolation and being trapped, which was found in spades in Black Sabbath's lyrical content. And the occult, but that's really just because Geezer Butler thought the occult was cool. And it is. It was a factory which also infamously claimed Tony Iommi's fingertips on his fretting hand, and the leather-wrapped plastic caps he used to cover the severed bits of his digits is in part what gives him his inimitable style and sound.
I had this job, which was a good job, if you like jobs. And I'd be on a line, and they'd pass stuff down to me, and I'd weld it, and then it would go on to somewhere else. And the one day, the person that would be sending me the thing to weld, it never turned up, so they put me on this giant, huge press, I mean massive, a guillotine type press that would come down, bang, and bend the metal. And so I'm there with this machine, and I don't know what happened. I must have pushed my hand in, and of course, bang, it came down, and it just took the ends. I actually pulled them off. As I pulled my hand back, it sort of pulled them off, and it was left with two stalks sticking out, the bone sticking out the top of the finger. And so I made my own tips. I got a washing up bottle, a plastic bottle, and melted it down into a ball. And then I got a hot soldering iron and would drill a hole out in it and fit it over my finger. So there's this big ball on my finger. And then I'd sit there for days just rubbing it down to make a shape of a finger. And I mean, it took a long time, and I'm trying to play with it, and it hurt, and I couldn't bend any string or anything. So I had to come up with an idea of what I could put on to grip the string. And I tried different cloths and material and just ripped off. And I had this old leather jacket from my rocker days. And so I decided to cut it up and put a bit of, try this leather, and it was great because it was a really old jacket. And glued it on, and it worked.
Now, back to the big argument. Black Sabbath are almost unanimously credited with founding heavy metal, though it would be nearly a decade before other acts strictly applied Sabbath's aesthetics to their own music. The sound generated by Judas Priest, high-pitched singing, harmonized guitar melodies, and speedier riffs caught on much more readily regarding music that was considered to be heavy metal as it came full force in the 80s.
To me, metal really is, I'd have to say Judas Priest, though, is more metal than Black Sabbath. Priest, to me, is the defining metal band. I'm talking heavy metal.
I wouldn't disagree with Zach. I mean, a lot of it was coming out of Birmingham, or the British invasion, they called it.
So, if Judas Priest more or less defined the heavy metal style, what still makes Black Sabbath the band that truly invented metal? If perhaps not the style, and we're not talking about the fashion style, Priest owned that. It has to be the sound.
I think it was the darkness to it and the mysterious, kind of almost 666 Satan thing. But then at first, what they were doing, we were just talking about that, is pushing their amps, turning up all the amps all the way. Iommi's famous like 12th fret, just super chords, and the riffs. It was the riffs and the groove of that band. Just the combination of that and Ozzy's voice, just on like War Pigs, he sounds like an evil preacher. I don't know, no one ever really was able to duplicate that. That was just a magic moment on Earth that those people happened to meet.
And it's that magic moment that eventually led Tony Iommi inadvertently resurrecting the feared devil's tritone, a sinister, demonic combination of notes that was allegedly forbidden to be used by composers in the Middle Ages.
All I remember was putting on, it was probably Black Sabbath, and I remember just being completely terrified and crapping my pants. But I enjoy soiling my pants.
Whether that anecdote is entirely true, the bit about the tritone being forbidden, not Zach filling his pants, may forever be a mystery. But what's no mystery is that those three notes, played in that order, forever changed heavy music, putting forth in motion an entirely new genre, heavy metal.
Rob Halford being more than twice my age, and and still being better than all of us doing that, beating everyone at being metal now, back then, and forever. Yeah, Judas Priest is the most metal thing ever.